Hey, so this is my first week of, what are we going to call it? Hosting, like
Yeah.
presenting, whatever. And I'm doing a subject that's near and dear to my heart, which is scientific literacy and what I'm going to term like the role of experts in our society. So I'm going to start by talking about sort of what I think the problem is and some approachable methods for people. And then we're going to talk about when we should rely on experts and when we shouldn't, and the costs and benefits of each approach. So, scientific method, people hear all the time. It isn't really one thing as much as it is like a collection of tools that we use to scrutinize information, to sort of detach good information from bad information and figure out what is quote unquote scientific and what isn't scientific. But people often misappropriate the term scientific because in our modern society it has very positive connotations, and it feels very good to say that you're on the side of science or you're presenting scientific data. And so often it's co-opted in situations where it shouldn't really be used. And there are several ways you can sort of look for these co-options, and I'm going to present a few of them and some of the history of how they came to be. So the first one I want to talk about was measurability, which is this idea of like what we are measuring in a situation and how we should measure it, and sort of the purpose of doing so. So Galileo is attributed as probably the father of science. Before Galileo's time, science was actually thought of as a creative endeavor, like an art that people sort of did almost recreationally. Like it was often in the realm of philosophy. There was very little done in the way of experiments or proving anything. It was a lot more of like what we would think of as Aristotle's approach to science, which is just like, maybe the world works like this. Like maybe there are 5 elements, and there's no work done other than this is a cool idea and a way of thinking about the world. And Galileo is the first guy, well, I shouldn't say the first guy. He's often attributed as being the guy who brought math into science and said, like, we can measure things and calculate things and things like that. And he has a very famous quote, which is to measure everything that you can measure and to make things measurable when they cannot be measured. And this is kind of the idea. And often when we talk about issues in society, we are unclear or we're intentionally misleading about what is actually being measured and how we're validating results. So an example that I wanted to use of sort of like a misuse of measurability is a famous story of during World War II, they were figuring out where to armor the airplane, because you can't armor it all the way around or else like it's too heavy and it'll fall out of the sky, right? And so they did a study of like where planes were being shot. So every time RAF planes came back, they would look at where the bullet holes were on the planes. And they realized that the majority of the bullet holes were on the wings and not on the fuselage of these planes. And the initial thought is to say like, well, because like we're seeing the most bullet holes on the wings, that's where they get shot the most often, that should be what we armor. But when the actual like scientists get into it, they're like, no, like the ones that get shot in the fuselage don't come back. Like what we're actually measuring is like which bullet wounds we're surviving, not where we're getting bullets. And so like the real result is like you have to armor the spots that don't come back with bullet holes, because those are more lethal, even though it seems counterintuitive. And data, you could see how data can be presented in a way to make it misleading by like showing something that you're measuring. So I guess like the point is look at what is actually being measured by data and not just what is being said as a result.
Mm-hmm.
And do targeted testing. Like we often see very broad results. Another famous example would be like 50% of marriages end in divorce, like the statistics everyone hears. And you're like, well, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that a marriage has like a 50% chance of failing? Like not necessarily. That's like a very different statistic. Like when you really get into it, a lot of people have, or some people have a lot of marriages and a lot of people have one marriage. And when you just look at an average of marriages, you're getting a misleading result. So that's like a basic tool of engaging with data. The second one, which is near and dear to my heart and more of my focus, is falsification. So there was an Austrian philosopher named Karl Popper around, he was born at the turn of the 20th century and worked all throughout the 20th century. And he worked to develop this idea in science of falsification, which is this idea of wording a hypothesis in a way that it can be tested and disproven effectively and efficiently. So we have, are you familiar with the idea of like an ontology, if I use that term?
No.
Okay, so an ontology is a statement that is true by virtue of how it's been formed rather than any sort of like data. So if I say like birds that are black are not white, that's an ontology because it's true independent of what you actually observe. Like no matter how many birds you look at, whether it's 0 or 1,000, it doesn't influence that statement. So while it is true and impossible to disprove a statement like that, that actually makes it like a very weak statement because it doesn't really, the idea is that it doesn't really say anything about the world and it's not backed up by data. Like it's just sort of a
self-referential.
Yeah, a circular statement, if you will,
yeah.
Self-referential. So, and Karl Popper's idea is that we want to avoid having ontologies in science because it contradicts the whole idea of a data-driven approach to have ontological statements that aren't impossible to back with data. So one of the examples he gives is like extraterrestrial life we might look at. So if you word a statement like there are aliens in the universe, that is a statement that's impossible to disprove because you can do 1,000 tests and not find aliens, and it doesn't make it any more or less true that there are aliens in the universe. Whereas if you do the opposite and say, like, there are no aliens in the universe, it only takes one failed test to prove that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a better approach to doing science. And we can look at this. So, and generally this idea of like a scientific statement should present the mechanism by which it would be defeated. Mm-hmm. Like if we are going to make a scientific idea, we would say, we believe this because these things are not true. And if any of them became true, that would disprove the statement, rather than these sort of like vague statements we tend to make that are like, well, like this is backed by this and this and this. And then you'd say, okay, well, all those are wrong. And then someone would be like, yeah, but what about this other thing I just thought of? Like, it doesn't really present the mechanism of its own defeat.
Yeah.
So that's like a basic overview. Karl Popper, very famous philosopher, one of the last philosophers to make meaningful contributions to science before it kind of became an entirely engineered discipline. And then the last one I was going to go over was just reducing things to more simple and approachable science. So often complexity is used as a tool to dissuade conversation in science. So global warming, I think, without getting into, I don't want to get too into global warming because I know it's controversial, but like global warming, there's a lot of efforts on both sides of the issue to just say like, it's so complex, it's not even worth talking about. But when you actually reduce it to simpler things, like the greenhouse effect is something that we could prove in like an elementary school classroom. Like a greenhouse effect is very simple. Like you have ultraviolet light that's able to pass through the atmosphere. It's re-emitted as infrared light that's not able to pass through the atmosphere. And it kind of bounces around and heats our planet. And you can see by like a car, or you can do experiments with a pop bottle and realize that like more gas trapped in that area will create like a warmer space than the space outside. And that's like a very simple, approachable, easy thing. Whereas if you try to make it a big, like the globe is warming, like we have to measure 10 million different variables and everyone has their own opinion, it becomes an intractably complex issue that people just give up on. Rather than we could reduce it to simple science and sort of approach it, I guess. Break it into manageable chunks, deal with them piece by piece. You can fairly clearly demonstrate that whether the planet is warming or not, the atmospheric CO2 is rising like meteorically by 2 or 3% a year. And if you can establish the greenhouse effect, it becomes fairly obvious that that's going to have long-term consequences. So that's sort of a broad overview of a couple scientific tools. There are lots, like the scientific method is a collection of hundreds of tools, and these don't all apply everywhere. Like evolution is a famous example of a theory that's not really falsifiable, but we still feel that it is generally true. They don't hold in every case, but these are tools we could use rather than relying on experts, which is the main topic of the discussion. So
Yeah.
yeah, sorry. I guess I just kind of went. So
No, I think that was a great introduction.
yeah.
I absolutely agree. We have a tendency to kind of put science on a pedestal where we think of it as something beyond these basic strategies, like
Yeah.
Approaching things with falsifiability and realizing that you can't disprove a negative and things like that. And just little strategies like Occam's razor, I think, are great ways
Occam's
to.
razor is another classic, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. And it's unfortunate that oftentimes science is put into this like separate category where only certain people are allowed to do it, or seen as people who can do it or can do it.
And let's be under no misgivings. Like, we are not going to sit down and split the atom between the two of us in a bedroom. But like, a lot of science is very approachable for everyday people if they're willing to do it. And I think like a big thing is just not being afraid to try to engage with it and check the math. And like, we all learned quite a bit of science in school, and many of us know more from reading and things like that. Like you said, it's not on a pedestal. Like, science is very democratic. It's accessible by anyone. That's supposed to be the point.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's probably a balance to be made between, like, if you get sick, you go to a doctor. We have authorities for a reason, and specialization of knowledge for a reason. And appealing to that can be incredibly useful and a shortcut. But at the same time, we need to be connected to this process to make it democratic and to make it.
Especially when it is like social policy.
Absolutely, yeah.
And like, so like an example that I would bring up that we brought up in our first episode, like police brutality. Like, often you hear with any sort of social issue, but in particular with police, you hear like, you need more funding. Like, obviously police need more money to get done what they're doing. But is that a falsifiable statement? Is there a point where we say like, more money isn't helping? And if people can't define what that point is, then they're not really thinking rationally about the issue. They're just like delivering what is essentially then an ontology, which is that more funding will make police better, that isn't interacting with data.
So, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think a great qualifier when describing or promoting any sort of policy is to compare to what. Like, is this a good idea? Well, compared to what does this produce?
How are we measuring the success of this policy? Like, how are we going to look in 5 years and say, was this good or not? Because like with a lot of things, like people be like, oh, like kids are struggling in school. And you'd be like, well, you're going to look at testing scores because that isn't necessarily the best like metric. And it's been shown to just change the way teachers teach and not really make kids any smarter. Or are we going to look at like dropout rates? Because that is, again, like attached to a lot of complicated things. What are we actually measuring when we say kids are struggling in school? And how do we improve it?
Yeah.
And how do we, with any policy, look at it and say whether it was a success or not? I think is an important step that's missing in a lot of social discourse. Like,
absolutely.
How do we come back to it and be like, did this work?
I think a lot of political policy is judged by its intent, for sure.
Absolutely. And intent is important. Like, we should look at a policy and be like, were people trying to do something good or just trying to fuck people over? Like, that's an important evaluation, especially with something like segregation or something like that. You look back, intent is an important part of it, but also like, did it actually do anything? Like, is increasing police funding actually making any difference at all in the measurable metrics?
Yeah, I guess by our own standards, though, anyone in our contemporary society is they're going to have a positive intent, and an intent we would share. So it feels like to focus on, it's frustrating how a lot of policies will just, their success will be based on if their intent was seen as politically viable.
Oh, absolutely.
Rather than,
and everything is presented as if it's good, right? Like,
even,
the worst policies we could imagine, like huge government subsidies for billionaires, which happens all the time. Like, that's presented as it's going to create jobs. It's going to do this. It's going to do that. But then when you actually measure it, typically it does not accomplish that goal.
Yeah. Or arguments for protectionism or against free
Yes.
trade or anything like that,
Example, right?
or
Like,
businesses being too big to fail, anything like that.
if
It's always
we
been
build a
presented to.
wall, is it actually going to affect immigration, or is it just like political posturing? You know,
Or like will affect violent crime or anything
yeah,
like that.
like, and again, part of measurability is what are we trying to measure, which is also a part of it that's missing. Like when we say like there's an immigration issue, like what is the issue? Is it purely like a number of immigrants? Is it a tax on the system? Is it about like crime? Like what needs to improve for us to consider this policy a success?
Mm-hmm.
And often that's just entirely absent. And when you review a policy in 5 years, nobody even, some things, there are literally pieces of legislation in the United States that nobody knows why they happened. Like the history is missing. Like Puerto Rico I was reading about, and it's like there was just random things included in large omnibus bills and nobody knows why, that just made the tax situation weird in Puerto Rico. And there's no history on how or why it happened.
They can't even untangle the source and when it. That's hilarious.
For sure. Okay, so getting into the deeper discussion,
the
role of experts in our society. So I'm going to propose that often, because people are unwilling to do the work of science, that we want to offload that work onto scientists and rely on either prominent scientists in our society that might be like your health director or NASA or something like that, like the kind of people that get interviewed on TV, or we're going to talk about a broad scientific consensus, neither of which are really under the scientific method like scientific approaches to the idea, because they're undemocratizing science and they're putting the power in the hands of certain people. And but there is an advantage in that, absolutely, in that it makes complicated issues that people aren't willing or aren't able to deal with, like something that we can act on, that otherwise we'd just be paralyzed and say we don't understand this. But I would propose that, I guess where I'd like to start discussions is, how do we pick those experts if we don't understand what they're supposed to be experts on? Like if we lack the tools to validate their research, how are we picking them? And I'll give it to you.
Oh God. I mean, I am woefully ill-equipped to answer that question. I think it's a very tough question.
I think often we're just given them. Like someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, like nobody really knows where he came from. He just popped up and he was like an expert all of a sudden. And I love Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I don't think he was vetted by society. He just sort of came into being. Or Bill Nye, the science guy, is even more so this. Like he's an engineer, he's not a scientist, but he has become like a prominent voice of science just by happenstance, rather than us like really going through and vetting his research or whatever, right? Like,
yeah, no, absolutely. I think, I'm not sure in my mind if there's any substitute for creating a culture of people who really value the process and kind of create a hierarchy where at the very bottom there are people who have no interest in science. They don't engage with any of the higher concepts, and they talk to people who read the research of people like Neil deGrasse Tyson who present the information. And I think at every stage you're appealing to a higher level of people who, like maybe for your average person, it's coworkers who follow the issues, and for them it's pundits on TV. And at every stage you try to hold the people above you more accountable, and you have your own kind of exchanges and debates and conflicts of those levels. I'm not sure. I don't think there should be a formal process, I guess is what I'm saying. I think it should be
it's certainly an informal process.
Yeah.
And I would say that's largely how it works now, I think.
Yeah.
Like if we're being fair, like to your point, like an everyday person is not reading scientific journals. They're probably getting it from the news, and maybe the news people are getting it from scientific journals. More likely they have like a person on staff, or they get it from another news. Like, yeah, there's a hierarchy where it sort of filters down and gets, not in a bad way, but dumbed down every step to make it like more approachable for the people of the rung it's serving.
And I do think certain scientists or sources of authority will become very popular, really because they're able to communicate things very effectively. And like I know certain people, like Keynes, I forget his first name. Keynes, the famous economist, was very famous John Maynard Keynes was very famous for being able to talk to his contemporaries in the language of economics and did very rigorous work, but at the same time could talk to a layman and distill things down into simple concepts, and it can actually communicate, whereas lots of experts are often their ivory tower, unable to articulate things in a way anyone can understand. And I think that's tips the balance towards people who are charismatic or just capable of talking about things on different levels.
Absolutely. And I think there's like a certain amount of like when scientists seem like, when you have the ivory tower intellectuals, when scientists seem weird, it creates this attitude of like, I'm not weird. Like, you know, scientists are something else. They're a different animal that like, I'm not going to do what they're going to do. The same way we might look at like a magician or something and be like, I can't like make myself disappear. Like, why would I even bother trying? Like, but I think that works up into the point of where we are now, which is that we have like a highly tribal society that is presenting like two rival factions of scientists on a lot of issues. And this is true, I think, of everything from like trans issues to global warming to like economics, like anything really.
Yeah, no, it's definitely makes it way worse for sure.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I'm not weighing in on any of those issues and like putting people down for believing one side or the other. But I think it is very much like people are not engaging with the data, anti-vaxxing, like things like that.
It's become very politicized.
Cases like the flat Earth, like, and I just think like, I think we have to do better. I guess like it's usually very easy to discredit a charlatan, even within the realm of science. And I think that's the first step. And people being like, really being able to read, like, not just an article about research, but read research and be like, does this experiment make sense? Like, how big is the sample group? Like the recent one, like the hydroxychloroquine guy. His name's escaping me. But there's a very prominent, famous French researcher who's like really the guy who's driving the hydroxychloroquine thing. And the study that he did was on like less than 100 people that he's like basing this result on. Like it was a very small study. And as soon as you go to that step of looking at the study, you'd be like, okay, this is obviously, whether it's correct or incorrect, it's not being done scientifically. Like it's a bad study.
It might be very limited in scope.
Yeah, which makes it bad, I would say. Like I'm comfortable saying that a study of less than 100 people is not enough data to make medical recommendations. And I think every scientist should know that.
Yeah, and enough to proceed, but not to like, you know, put it on the market with glowing recommendations.
I don't want to say on the other side, like we shouldn't be shutting down research either. Like that's enough to say we should look into this. It is not enough to say inject yourself with this chemical. Like there needs to be a line in the middle that we can get to.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is just reading it, you know, like
I do think
it's hard to read, but
stumbling block right there. And I do think we'll probably agree in that. I don't think there's any firm solutions to these problems. Probably just a lot of tendencies that make the problems worse, and various smaller solutions that can address the problem to some degree, but don't actually just completely solve it. And definitely one of the problems I think makes it way worse is the politicization of science and how lots of things are framed in terms of a left versus right opinion versus rather than, you know, a nuanced take or whatever it happens to be. And just the whole being expected to hold a certain view based on your political allegiance, I think is very toxic to the whole scientific process.
And like, not like, one of the easiest tests I think of like a real scientist is that any real scientist has admitted they were wrong about something. Like a very important part of the scientific process is like this, we tried this and it didn't work. Like when you look at like an approach that's like, regardless of data, we're not changing. Like I look at this with like flat earthers. Like it's like you throw so much data at them and they're just like, no, like, and you're like, okay, well then that's not, and it's fine if people want to, like, it's fine for people to rule on issues for non-scientific reasons, but then we shouldn't describe it as science. Deferring to an expert is not scientific. It is like an emotional thing. It's saying, I'm comfortable with this person telling me how to think.
It's an appeal to authority.
Science. And we shouldn't say that that's any better. It's no better for that person to be Neil deGrasse Tyson than it is for them to be like your crazy uncle that spouts theories at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like,
well, maybe it's better, but it's no more science. We should say
it's not. Yeah, it's no more scientific. We should say.
Yeah.
You've vetted better, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I really question how much people have really vetted somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who, again, I believe he's a very good scientist, but I don't think very many people are actually looking into his background at all. They just see he's on the news, he's allowed to talk, he's probably smart. Like, I think it stopped. I really do think it stops there for most people.
Absolutely. If someone is on the news talking about things in a coherent, articulate way, and they seem to know what they're talking about, and no one's dragging them off with a cane off the side of the screen, then
exactly,
that's pretty much all you need to hear.
And like on the other side too, if you like, a lot of people will just hear like, oh, like Jenny McCarthy went up and said like some completely ridiculous nonsense, and you don't even need to like really look at what she said. Like, you just be like, yeah, she's a whack job. Like, without really vetting that information. And most of the time that works pretty well, but increasingly it is not working, especially with these issues that have like massive economic and like societal implications that people have a vested interest in sort of obscuring.
Yeah, no, I've heard there are trends. I heard there are negative trends to this in this way, where it seems like funding is more perverting the issue and the incentives, and where scientists are finding more and more pressure to go after the funding in various ways. And I did a little bit of research on this since we last talked for this video, but I haven't done enough to be able to talk confidently about to what extent this is happening and to what extent it's getting worse. But I do get the impression that it is getting worse, that scientists are finding more pressure to appeal to financial interests and incentives than actually just follow the data. And as you say, that the main purpose of science is to disprove yourself. That's mainly what scientists are trying to do, is to try to falsify the running theory that they have. But
what you learn when you study science is like actually proving something is usually impossible. Proving evolution is impossible. Like proving the Big Bang is impossible. Like you can't go there and take a photo of it. Like you just you rule out everything else, and then after like I think it's Sherlock Holmes. It's like after you've eliminated everything that's impossible, whatever's left, no matter how improbable it seems, is the truth. Like and that's really how science works. Like it's like, well, like this doesn't happen and this doesn't happen, and as you rule out more things, it increasingly seems like evolution always fits the data. Like this trend always seems to hold true, and then sometimes those trends get upended again. Like Newtonian models of gravity are now being upended by like more Einsteinian models, like models that held true for thousands of years. When you measure them really precisely and look at what's really happening, like the numbers don't quite line up. They were just really close. And that's the thing that happens too. Like all of the science we believe in now will probably be laughably false 200 years from now, but it will have been a step towards the truth.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it definitely seems like I've noticed a lot where in conversations people will use a scientific opinion as like a club to like shut down a conversation. It's like, well, this is something that a scientist believes or a scientific conclusion, so you're wrong.
Yeah, that's unscientific. And you're like, what does that mean? Describe to me unscientific.
Yeah, it definitely seems, and I think that's partially a product of the fact that these conversations are had in such a toxic political environment where we're encouraged to like shut down the wrong opinion for the good of society, so to speak.
Yes, like and it's very easy if you want to shut somebody down to use science, because it's really easy to say like, well, an unscientific position has no spot at the table, right? Like
absolutely. What do you think of things like scientism?
I'm not familiar with the term of scientism.
I guess scientism is when I think it's generally understood as when people promote science as the highest form of philosophy, that we need nothing else but it, and it's a source of morality. I know people like Sam
like
Harris.
David Hume kind of stuff. Like
I'm not familiar with I guess David Hume, what he said around.
He's like basically the idea of like science is above logic. That like what we can see is more important than any sort of like theoretical model.
Or basically, or just it's a very interesting trend. Like derive morality or a sense of meaning from science, and it tends to, I find lots of people who subscribe to this kind of way of thinking, they tend to degrade philosophy in general, and they don't really realize that philosophy is an expression of, or science is an expression of philosophy and a subset of it. But it's just a, I guess more of just a throwaway question where I was interested if you.
I think like these things are all interrelated in a way. Like science is obviously, like I would argue that mathematics is a highly philosophical endeavor more than a scientific endeavor. Like math is not really based on observable facts as much as it's based on like theory. And nobody would say that science trumps like mathematics. Whereas people might say, like philosophy is sort of like kicked down in our society a little bit. Like that's the classic, like the guy with the philosophy degrees flipping your burgers at McDonald's and stuff like that. We don't have the same respect for it that society's had for it, you know, a couple hundred years ago. And it's really interesting that like we don't at all turn to philosophers for like questions of morality in our society, like even a little bit. Like, we'd never see like an ethicist on the news talking about like the right approach to something. Like it's just not something we do at all anymore.
I think we think of it as just like questions around like, oh, people who just like consider free will and determinism, or think about brains in jars and if they are aware of their existence.
Like a lot of like shoegazing type of stuff, right? Like,
rather than like, I think to me the perfect example is all legal theory. All of our legal system is based on philosophy ultimately, and questions of right and wrong and justice and
well, and I'm a big believer in like and this is sort of like on the other end of it, but like just basic like predicate logic, like really being like, I believe this, like connecting it, like we were talking about, like connect it to simpler and simpler ideas and like show like that path, like because I believe in freedom, I therefore believe in this situation, and then because of that belief there are other beliefs that balloon out of it like a spider web. Rather than like, we tend to evaluate things in a vacuum and then you don't really understand like why people believe what they believe. Like, you know, abortion, I think, again, touching all the controversial topics, like ultimately you either believe a fetus is alive or you don't. And people believe that largely for personal reasons. There really isn't a scientific, as much as people would like to think there isn't a scientific definition of like when something is alive or when it can feel pain or whatever. We have certain ways of measuring it and we try to inform the debate, but ultimately, like if you believe it's a living thing, it'll never be okay. And if you don't believe it's a living thing, then it's not something that you are concerned about. Like, and the sooner people realize that the whole debate is around that, you'll stop debating a bunch of stupid stuff, like corner cases that aren't really important.
That's the thing. I feel like a lot of the debate around these things they get caught up in these issues that, they kind of are very much a distraction. I think the same thing is happening around vegetarianism and
vegetarianism is another good example.
You're gonna draw the line somewhere around what you think is the, form of life that we should ascribe moral value to.
Absolutely.
And it's a very, very subjective line because it's such a grayscale at many points.
Absolutely. And vegetarianism is a good example where like people are vegetarians for different reasons, right? Like
absolutely.
Some people, a lot of people, not so much in North America, but in like the third world, a lot of people are vegetarian largely as like a reality of their economic situation. Like meat is very expensive. A lot of people in the third world.
India
is a classic example. A lot of people in India are vegetarian. And it's just because meat is very expensive and not very widely accessible. You can't get a 99-cent hamburger at the corner like you can here. And like, but like for me, like I'm tempted to go vegetarian for like the environmental impact far more than like the animal rights side. Not that the animal rights side isn't important too, but like the idea of like, it's now fairly demonstrable that like beef in particular, but also like pigs are like really bad for the environment and they're very destructive to like the natural ecosystems and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And like that to me is far more compelling than the wildlife thing. And so if someone's going to try to talk me into or out of being a vegetarian, it's important to understand how I'm getting there, not just where I am. You know, where am I like extending back to? What are the core ideas that I'm deriving it from? And what are the connections that I'm building? And I think that's an exercise that like philosophy can be very useful in, like logic, and just being like, oh, like you have two premises and a connection to here, and either the premises are wrong or the connection is wrong. Attacking like the end result is kind of fruitless.
Yeah, absolutely. Promoting just a familiarity with why people believe things and the nuances between them, I think would promote a lot more empathy and just help people have the real conversations that they could be having rather than talk about nothing.
And raise the quality of conversation.
Like, yeah, because like we might still disagree, but at least let's disagree on something meaningful and interesting.
Exactly. Like falsification, I encourage as like a key piece of like meaningful conversation. Like there's conversation that's just like sharing, but if you're really like debating something, part of that should be like falsification. Like what do you need to show me to prove me wrong? Like, and I should be able to tell you that. Like, I'd be like, I believe this would have a negative environmental impact. And if you tell me that that's not the case, then I'll stop believing it, because that's the reason. If I have a reason to believe something, that reason is the mechanism by which I would be convinced otherwise, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Very clearly provides. And if people can't can't present that, like, I'm not saying people have to present it on the fly, but if you really can't come up with that falsification case, then come to terms with the fact that you just believe it arbitrarily. Like it's just something you like or something that appeals to your sensibilities or whatever.
Yeah, and if you do take truth seriously and the process by which we approach truth, like science, then coming up with that falsifiable statement or falsifiable aspect of your belief system is such an important part of moving forward towards that thing that you value. And I think a lot of people who, I think in part of their brain, they really do value truth. They don't realize the value of these falsifiable statements. They see a lot of statements of truth as just kind of like just like an intuition thing that they'll drift from one place to another.
Precisely. And like a lot of people, I think, evaluate truth socially. Like I think there's a lot of like, I really think, and I don't think this is always bad, but I think there are a lot of people that are like, if my friend group all changes their mind on this issue, I will like change my mind. Like it's not really an independent thing that I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think we see that with lots of issues right now where perspectives are changing so fast where like I think trans issues is a good example. Yeah. And without actually making a statement about what I believe, because I think that's a very complicated topic.
We could do a whole episode on that and get our channel shut down.
Absolutely, we could. I think a lot of people, relative to 10 years ago, a lot of people now support and believe in trans rights as if it's like an obvious thing that if you don't support this, you're a complete fool. If you don't believe that there's no meaningful difference between the sexes, then you're a complete, or if you believe there's a meaningful difference, rather, you're a complete fool, and they'll act like this is the scientific obvious reality. And I don't think it's because they've actually studied,
absolutely,
evolutionary psychology or all the relevant disciplines that would tell you if there's a meaningful difference between the sexes. It's just because their social sphere has changed and the incentives have changed.
Like something that's perhaps like a little bit more decided and less controversial. Like if we look at like generally like gay marriage and like the acceptance of gay people in our society, or homosexual people, I guess. Like is gay like gender specific? Is gay only men?
I think it's depending on who you ask, but I think it applies to anyone.
Anyway, like generally, and I'm fully in favor of gay rights and everything. It is not an issue that was like adjudicated in science. Like the science never caught up and like proved anything. It was really just that like eventually most people knew a gay person and that changed everything, right? Like as soon as as people like start to have a gay child or a gay friend, or like your weird aunt finally marries the lady she was always hanging out with or whatever, like as more of that happens, like people just won't hold those beliefs. People won't throw away their family for an outdated idea about LGBT issues. And eventually that creates a social shift far more than like, I think if you could rewind to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, people really thought it was going to be a scientific thing. People were looking for the gene. People were looking for like scientific solutions to that issue, and they never materialized. And in fact, it's not even really seen as important research anymore.
It shouldn't be morally relevant, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
like, but there's often an attempt, again, because of what we've discussed, to root it in science. Because if your side gets the scientific thing, then like there's this feeling of like, well, nobody could dispute it. Like,
Yeah.
it's a choice, blah, 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 like whatever you believe. Like as soon as the science seems to back that up, all of a sudden it changes everything.
Yeah. Allegedly. I'm just gonna close my window. There's a sound happening outside.
Yeah, no problem.
So when you edit the video, that's the part you have to remove right there.
Yeah.
That's all the work.
I was just gonna like black you out and cut your audio from the whole thing.
It's just you talking. And it's just like a face, like a clip.
You're the
of
audience
me,
in this episode.
Oh, nice. It was just like a clip of me, a screen crap with like a face like, eh, and it's
yeah,
like,
exactly.
Wah, 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 wah.
The sneeze photo, like.
Exactly, and just like a wah wah sound whenever I'm talking.
Yeah, I just like cut back and forth between two pictures to make it look like your mouth's moving. Like South Park, like.
Perfect.
Yeah. So like to sort of bring it back and open up like another big subject, like what is the right way now? Like forgetting about, I've presented my like idyllic future where people actually do science, but people don't do science now. And we're not going to get there in 6 months. So with the complicated issues of science that are too difficult for people to understand, how should we like adjudicate them or maybe like rule policy on them as a society? So something like anti-vaxxing, for example. Like how should we handle an issue like that as a society where like the science is largely decided, but it's too complicated. And it is like, for people who aren't willing to do the work, like it is very compelling to be like, there's mercury in here, there's formaldehyde in here, like these are toxic chemicals, and it's not easy to show that like they don't hurt you, even though like that's what the data seems to, like how do we as a society deal with something like that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think we're doing wrong is a lot of the people who are anti-vaxxers believe that their position is scientific.
Yeah.
So it's not that they are anti-science. They have just been led to believe that their positions are grounded in scientific evidence. And I think a big problem is that when we approach them, we are approaching them as if we're talking to someone who doesn't value science. We often like degrade them. We often make fun of them. And I think for a lot of these people, because they sincerely value science and they sincerely want what's best for their children, speaking to the reasons that they have for opposing this position would be a huge benefit. And I think it's really, I think a huge problem is that we don't do that. We just dismiss, degrade, make fun of. And I think if someone really proves that they're a bad actor and has no intent of having a sincere conversation, at that point, maybe it makes sense to make fun of them and degrade them in a spotlight in front of society and put them on a pedestal. This is something you shouldn't be doing. But for the vast majority of people, I think we should be promoting just a empathic conversation of let's try to share what's happening here. Yeah. I see so little of that.
I think that's very true. I do think there's a meaningful distinction like there to be made between what I would call like the followers of the belief system, like the people who are sort of, and again, I think it's important to state that yes, they are engaging with science, but they are not like, they're not the ones on TV, like the everyday people. Maybe that's a better term than followers. And I think they need to be dealt with differently than someone like Jenny McCarthy, who like realistically does have access to sources, does have the means to like, like she could very easily get a one-on-one interview with any biologist in the country and doesn't. And like, that's a different issue than you're a guy seeing things on the news, worried about your child, and making what you think is an informed decision. Like, I think there is a lot of room for us to say Jenny McCarthy is like a dangerous moron without saying that like people who are part of that, ascribing to that belief, are necessarily like doing it for malicious or incompetent reasons.
Yeah, and even still, I think if we're dealing with someone like Jenny McCarthy on stage with live cameras going, I think there would be huge benefit in approaching it as if you were talking to someone like a mother acting on behalf of her child, sitting at home, and talking to her as if you're just very much, here's the information, and if she rejects it and throws out a bunch of nonsense, just warmly address why that is not the case. And
That's fair. Maybe I was overly harsh.
But I do think
my position would be that Jenny McCarthy is intentionally presenting something she knows is false because it has made her very famous.
And I think that's probably the case at this point. Although it's hard to say, because some people are just so, by the very nature of psychology, the second they're pushed back against, she's probably dug in her heels and is so ideological at this point.
She's got a lot of pushback.
She's not going to consider the perspective outside her own. But
do you think, and I'm not advocating for this, but just to open a discussion, do you think there's ever a place for deplatforming people who are like spreading perhaps what we would call dangerous misinformation? Like if people are misinforming people in a way that could cause them to harm themselves or others, is there ever a place for us to say, like, we're not going to allow this sort of information to be disseminated? Or that we're going to punish people who do so?
Yeah, my personal take is that if someone presents bad information, then the response should be to correct that information. And then if they continue to ignore that you corrected them and continue to basically demonstrate that they're a bad actor and insincere and just not really caring about what they're doing, then pointing that out and pointing out, like, with good evidence that that's going on, like say Dr. Oz is just a complete charlatan, making fun of him in a wide, I think that would be the solution, and creating a culture where we mock people who demonstrate an inability or lack of desire to engage honestly. That's my personal take, because I don't think we should deplatform anyone. I think if they have a platform, that's a good opportunity to engage with someone popular, showing why they're wrong and how they're
I can agree with that. I think we could have more of an expectation. Like, when I really look at people like Dr. Oz and Jenny McCarthy, I'm like, you're a multimillionaire with connections. Like, do a study, do the research if that's what you believe in. Like, for a fraction of what you earn in a year, you could fund a very strong study on vaccines and autism, and really like show a definitive. If you don't feel like the research is being done and it's not there, do it. Like, in America, it's very easy to do a scientific study. Like, and people don't. And I think that's very revealing, that Dr. Oz doesn't, like, you know, pay 1,000 volunteers to take his miracle weight loss pill. He just goes on TV and hawks it, right? Like,
yeah, I definitely believe he in particular is a complete.
Well, he was actually found to be a fraud in like court, wasn't he?
Okay,
you have to pay.
Not surprised.
Money, I think, but
yeah, I
stop calling himself a doctor. I think.
I can't believe he's still on magazines. I saw him like the other day on the cover of a magazine. He's still out there. He's still hawking his wares.
It's amazing how once you become famous, it's impossible to stop being famous.
Yeah, as long as you get enough followers from a certain demographic who aren't concerned about, critical thinking or disproving what they believe about you, then they're your fans. They don't care, and they're just gonna carry you to the goal line every time. It's insane.
Like, it always amazes me. Like, Macaulay Culkin is still like very, like, you still see like tweets from him and stuff all the time. I'm like, he hasn't done anything in 20 years. Like,
okay, but he's pretty sweet though.
No, like, he's great, but I just mean, like, it never fades. You know,
I know,
like,
it's absolutely true. Yeah,
because he made Home Alone when he was like 12, he'll be famous for the rest of his life. We'll be reading his tweets when he's 70.
Yeah,
and it's just interesting that, like, it's so hard to break that barrier, but once you're there, you're there.
Yeah, it's true.
Like, it really is almost like a class system. Like, once you become that, very hard to do it.
You're that embedded in the culture and
and sometimes it's just like random. Like, a lot of the infomercial guys that got like really famous out of like nowhere, like the Slap Chop guy, like produced a movie. Like,
it's pretty wild.
I know.
Do you know? Are you a fan of James Randi?
I'm not familiar with James Randi.
James Randi was a famous magician who he just started noticing that a lot of psychics were traveling the countryside and performing these psychic tricks or these demonstrations of paranormal ability. And he's like, those are parlor tricks. I can do those with like a $5 fake deck of cards or whatever. And so what he did, he worked with Penn and Teller a lot as well. And he would travel the countryside and go on these national talk show television shows in like I think the 70s and 80s, and live on TV demonstrate that these people were scam artists. Like, they would be blowing the pages of the book to move the pages, and he'd be like, oh, put tape on your mouth, now do the trick. and be like, oh.
Well,
I
that's
think,
an example. Like, I think what really killed the TV psychic phenomenon is that, like, I want to say it was like one of like the big science, like David Hitchens or something like that. But like they literally just had a prize. He's like, I'll give $1 million
that's
to
him.
anyone who will let me rigorously and scientifically observe you. And if you can really demonstrate it, like, you know, infinite money, basically.
That was James Randi. That was James Randi.
That
And
was James Randi.
Yeah, the $1 million challenge.
Yeah, and nobody can do it, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that just shows you, like, it's bupkis. Like,
Yeah, he's like, give me a double-blind, falsifiable experiment.
yeah.
And nope.
And when we demand that as a society, they shrink away. Like, nobody is balling up and being like, I can, because it makes you realize they know they're fake. Like, if they thought it was real, there'd be people lining up to do that, right?
Yeah,
like,
it's like, because you can make this money in an afternoon, give half of it to charity, and then like retire on an island. Like
totally.
It's not like you're being at all selfless. You're
not to mention you'd be the most famous TV psychic in history. Like, if you really proved it. If you won, like, that would make your career.
Yeah.
But like, and that's what it really shows. Like, if people were genuine, because there's always the arguments like they think they're psychic and like maybe they're the ones that are misinformed, but then they'd be lining up to do that.
Yeah.
If they really thought they could do it, they'd be like, of course I can do this. Like, and the fact that they don't reveals that they're charlatans.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that would be, in my mind, the perfect example to whatever people we think we might have to deplatform. I think that's the best strategy, is to have the James Randi tour the countryside, mocking them on live television, providing challenges that illuminate them for the dishonest individuals they are.
Absolutely. And like, that would be great television. Like,
yeah, it is. It continues to be. I love watching those clips. They're great.
Yeah. I think people really like that. Like, do you remember when we were kids, there was like the masked magician on TV, and he would like give away all the secrets? He would just like do magic tricks, and his whole thing was that he wore a mask because like the Magicians Alliance would like try to kill him if they knew who he was or whatever. But like, he gave away all the secrets to like famous tricks and stuff, and it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, I didn't see that. That sounds hilarious. I love the idea of there being like a magician cabal who, like, if you step out of line, they'll like come after you and like don't give away like the infinite like ribbon trick or whatever, the handkerchief that doesn't stop. Can't tell them that, or we'll.
Yeah, exactly. That's a dark secret. You take that to the grave. Have you seen Arrested Development?
I have.
That's
exactly what I'm
That's where the
about.
Magician's Alliance is.
Oh, I hope it's really like that. I bet it kind of is.
One of my favorite scenes when he's at the birthday party with like the 14-year-old magician or whatever. They're like, I'm sorry, we're just more comfortable with an alliance-approved magician.
Yeah. Sorry, traitor. Just like, fuck you, traitor. Oh, I swear. Oh no. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you have any? I have some notes. Well, where would you like to bring this conversation?
I could take it anywhere. This is like, if I was really to say there's one issue that's like my issue, like this is my issue. Like,
okay,
I'm willing to have this fight every day with everyone for the rest of my life.
Cool. All right.
I really believe it's so important as we move forward.
Yeah. Well, so I'm just going to ask you some random questions. What do you think of the idea of many intellectuals feel very comfortable speaking outside of their area of expertise, and that just being a general problem? So
I think, again, there's a line to be drawn, and I really think there could even be a legal line drawn. Like, there's a difference between saying, you know, Neil deGrasse Tyson, like, what's your opinion on like this year's fall fashions? And he can like say something. Like, it's not like you can only speak to what you're an expert on.
Yeah.
But like sometimes experts are speaking in a way that is a call to action. Like, if you get on the news and you're trying to convince people to act in a certain way, then you should be held accountable to that. And you have to like, there's more responsibility in doing something like that. Like, if you're going to tell people how to vote, there's more responsibility there than telling people like, oh, like the insides of black holes are fascinating. Like,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's two very different types of things. And I worry a lot that people place a lot of stock in what anyone famous will say about anything. Like, There are a lot of people that are going to vote for Kanye West for president. Like, there are a lot of people that voted for Donald Trump for president, who is also just a random celebrity. Like, and I think we should be wary about that. I'm not sure I would go as far as to say we should shut it down, but there should perhaps be like punishments if something bad comes as a result of it, especially if it's deliberate misinformation. Like, if you can demonstrate someone's lying to people on purpose and that causes people to not vaccinate their children or something like that, I think that's a punishable offense, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I definitely think I like the idea that we should be able to draw a line between when an expert is speaking with authority on the subject that they've studied for years, and then when they shift to talking about something else. I think
they're no longer an authority.
Yeah, and I think we're putting a lot of stock in their advice as if they're a doctor. It's like as if we were appealing to an economist and saying, okay, what do you think of all these economic issues? It's like, okay, also I have this cyst on my belly. Should I operate? It's like, yeah, absolutely. Well, a doctor could be held medically or legally responsible for giving bad advice, but it's almost as if we get bad advice from an individual who's not in any way licensed or
absolutely. Do you think that's a different argument than just your neighbor saying, oh, I had a cyst and this is what I had done? Like, is it different because they're in the public eye, or is it purely an issue of people giving advice they're not qualified to give?
I think it's, a little bit different. It's of the same category where it's you're giving advice you're not qualified to give, but it's different because people put a lot of stock and a lot of faith in you because you're recognized as someone we trust. You're on the news, you're an actor, you're a famous whoever it is. And I do think there needs to be, I'm not sure if it's, legal consequences or what, but I think maybe just social consequences that come from a public awareness that there is a difference between a public, or there's a difference between an intellectual talking about their issue or their, area of expertise and something else. And we just need to, I think, become aware of that.
Even within their field. There's a story I'll share from the dark pages of the history of science. So around the turn of the century, people were getting really into like curing diseases, essentially. Like, we had this big boom where like all of a sudden we could finally cure things, and we really hadn't cured anything for like 2,000 years. And all of a sudden we're like, disease has been around for millennia, we're curing them. And the guy who cured, I cannot remember his name, it's Carl something, which is like every German scientist. The guy who cured anthrax became like very famous when he cured anthrax. And he started working on a tuberculosis medicine. And essentially he lied to everybody and like refused to go out the recipe to this miracle cure that he was distributing, and got like a whole bunch of money because he held the patents and everything. And then it was like a fraud. Like, it didn't actually work. But because he had previously done this groundbreaking work on anthrax, this tuberculosis medicine, which like at the time, tuberculosis was like the most common cause of death. Like 1 in 7 people was dying of tuberculosis. And like hundreds of people died taking this like fake cure that he had made because he was able to throw like the weight of his name behind it. Wow. So even when people are talking in their field, we can still go a step deeper and be like, yeah, this isn't very scientific. Why isn't he giving away the recipe? Like, why is he being so secretive about it? Like, yeah. He hated Louis Pasteur. They had like a lifelong sort of rivalry, I guess you could call it, that pretty much ended abruptly when he like was exposed as a fraud.
Yeah, it was revealed to be a terrible,
it's so
terrible
weird
person.
He like legitimately did do like real research and like was foundational and like all of these other things, and then just like lied for the money, basically. Like,
I wonder if like something snapped within him or something. What happened?
I think it was like he really didn't like Louis Pasteur, and he was very paranoid about Louis like stealing his research, because there was some allegations that Louis had done that previously. And so that was his justification for the secrecy or whatever. Right. Like, the way he would tell it would be that he was under a lot of pressure to deliver something, and that he had to lie about it in order to keep his funding going.
Okay. But,
the other story is that he just lied, like he just wanted to have lots of money, and like The real question is whether he was legitimately trying to solve it or whether he was just bullshit.
Right, exactly. There's obviously some degree of fraud, but he could have been somewhat sincere as well.
Yeah, his miracle cure was basically just glycerin. Like,
huh. Okay.
I wish I could remember his name. I almost want to do like a little 5-minute follow-up to every episode where we're just like, here's like the shit that we talked about that we didn't know, or like here's something I said that was complete bullshit after I googled it afterwards. Like,
I've definitely already done that where I referenced something, like the thing about Rockefeller. I like to do like a quick, like at the end of that video, I'll link to like, oh, by the way, here's where I actually talk about Rockefeller.
Because I like Googled it, like I went to the Wikipedia page being like, there's going to be like a whole section of like 500 things. And I really had to like dig in to be like, okay, like there was like some secret contracts with railroads and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But like, it wasn't what I thought, which was just that it was like rampant, like monopoly abuse.
Yeah. Well, he's a very interesting character in all of
He had alopecia, hey? Like he was completely hairless at the time of his death.
Yeah, when he got all the controversy around his company got really heated, he lost all of his hair, all over his body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's anyway. We'll come back to him at the appropriate time.
But no, I think that'd be good to do like a little 5-minute follow-up episode almost to be like fact check or something. Yeah.
Yeah, we could even like record those independently of like I'll just like do like a 5-minute like.
Totally. Yeah, like it doesn't even need to be both of us. You can just be like, hey, here's like things I said that were wrong. Like, or things that like I couldn't remember and here's like a link or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to like the democratization of knowledge, I think one thing that I thought of was that they found when they study corporations that are more democratized, they are often outperformed by corporations that are more authoritarian or run by individuals or like defined leadership. And this is oftentimes because knowledge is localized within certain individuals, and it's not often like the relevant information for running a company isn't always shared by everyone who would have democratic influence. And that's literally a throwaway point that I thought you might want to comment on, is that sometimes the democratization of knowledge is very useful, but sometimes to have effective rulership or leadership, it's actually very counterproductive.
So I would say generally, and I'm going to reference the Cold War as like one case study that I can draw on for this. Generally, an authoritarian approach tends to provide short-term advantages, is what we see. So like when you saw the Soviet Union, like the first 20 years of the Soviet Union, they outpaced America on every single metric. And like they did better in World War II, many would argue. They had superior technology. They were the first to like every milestone in space except the moon. But it's harder for them to adapt and grow over time.
Right.
So like you can take, and I'll use like, there's a very famous example that not many people are aware of. And so the Soviet Union broadly rejected the scientific concept of genetics. Like they felt that it was like a Nazi, like non-socialist approach to like science, I guess. And they just rejected the idea of genetics. So they, and in particular, like agriculturally, they were pursuing like these entirely different models that just didn't work. And it eventually is one of the main factors that led to their downfall. Whereas in America, like what really won is just that we scientifically like propagated so quickly, and we were able to say like, okay, like 20 years after the car is invented, like everyone has one and there's roads everywhere. And that never happens in the Soviet Union. Like 20 years after the refrigerator is invented, like it's in everyone's home. Like, because we're able, you have all these people trying multiple things at once and like going off in random directions that can't be anticipated. Whereas in an authoritarian approach, you can say, we're going to throw like an infinite amount of resources in this direction and move forward very quickly, but it's harder to branch out when you only have one guy's ideas driving the train, if you will.
Yeah.
So that would kind of be my perspective on that. That sometimes when you have an existential issue, like something like COVID, for example, that's like a very looming present threat where we need to create a large amount of research very quickly. An authoritarian approach, which is largely what's being done. It's very much government-driven research. Here's like $1 billion divided among universities, like find stuff. That can work very well. But sustaining that approach over a period of 20, 30, 40, 50 years doesn't seem to work well.
Yeah. Could I give my token libertarian response?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think I don't think the metaphor of the communist government is a good metaphor for the totalitarian, or I think
Absolutely.
because it's not so much that America represented a decentralization or a decentralized model, because they had within their model these authoritarian corporations. So I think what makes the American model, or not the American model, because it's not necessarily free market, but what I like about the free market approach is that you can have move towards economy of scale to the degree that it is useful. And so you have a tendency towards authoritarianism to the degree that it's useful. And then you have a tendency towards decentralization to the degree that it is actually competitive and producing the results that you want. And I do think, yeah, so I think in that case, that metaphor is a little bit off, but I do agree that authoritarianism can be very useful in a very life or death scenario where you need to just literally take people's money to put it towards funding to stop the meteor coming towards the Earth, or whatever it happens to be.
Like the Manhattan Project would be an example where it was like, okay, like largely under a totalitarian model of a wartime government, we seized resources, we literally like nuked like American communities. Like there was all sorts of horrifically unethical and illegal research done very quickly in a very short amount of time. A lot of people died of radiation poisoning, but at the end we created like a space age technology that would have taken a century to produce otherwise, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. And I think,
arguably it was never created again. Like every other country that has them stole it from the United States.
Yeah.
So,
so definitely, while I take, moral issue with the authoritarian reaches in this respect, I see that there may be a pragmatic necessity in certain circumstances, for sure.
I would tend to in defense of your position, I would say that the authority will organically arise when there's a need for it.
I want to believe that that's the case. That's the thing.
So and not necessarily in like the libertarian model of like everyone will freely adopt it, but like when there's a crisis and people are making emotional decisions, someone will take advantage of that and rise to the top and do what needs to be done. Like that's always what happens in history. Genghis Khan appears from nowhere and like rises to the top of your civilization. You know what I mean? Like, and many of those leaders, when you look at their history, they had nothing. All they were was like ruthless and powerful, and like they didn't like. It's not like Genghis Khan was a prince or anything. He was like a nobody who just like rose through the ranks because people needed that kind of leader.
It is funny to that,
or whatever, right? Like,
to some extent, it seems like authoritarianism is sometimes an expression of market demand for this type of leadership in a crisis.
Yeah. Like if you truly view the libertarian model of like things organically arise as people want them, like of course that's what happens, right? But I don't think they happen. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that happens like through free association and like, formal contracts and things like that. It's a lot of like, I'm going to subjugate everyone in this area, and then we're going to subjugate all the towns, and that coalition will subjugate the rest of the country, and we'll stop the meteor.
I guess, the libertarian would say he would prefer that that's how it happens, that it just happens emergently and voluntarily, but obviously.
Like I look at the CCP in China, right? Like how they rose to power was that like the federal government failed in World War II and became like so reviled by the population that like a new authoritarian, even more authoritarian power rose from the ashes because people needed it. They're like, we need something strong to kick the Japanese out of our country. And if they have to, do a whole bunch of sketchy shit to make that happen, we're okay with that.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Or enough of us are okay with it anyway.
There's enough market demand, so to speak, that it will emerge.
Which is really how it's going to happen. How anything happens, right? Like green technology will be the same way. It won't be kind to the people that work in the petroleum industry. It'll be like a probably very abrupt shift where people will just stop accepting technologies that are destroying the planet. Like if you ascribe to that model, which I am not in this episode advocating for it, although I've brought it up several times. But
so what do you think of the idea, or just the problem of the financial incentives, where a lot of research departments are approached with an offer like, do you need X number of $1 million to study this problem? And if you respond, well, no, I don't need that money to study the problem because the problem isn't a real problem, then you don't get the money. So there's a strong financial incentives based on how it's set up right now to believe in problems where they don't actually exist.
Yeah. So I'm going to make a point here. It's a very broad point and probably not one that we can fully unpack. But generally, capitalism tends to incentivize engineering a lot more than it incentivizes actual research. So if you think about like a technology like splitting the atom, like the amount of wealth that needs to be invested in doing something like that is so vast that it's very difficult for capitalism to allocate those resources as needed. But capitalism is very good at solving engineering problems, which is like, we need to make this part smaller. We need to make it more energy efficient. Like we need to solve, solving problems. Capitalism is very good at and does much better than any other system, which is why,
clear point.
And making things cheap in particular is like the real strength of capitalism. Like the idea that a refrigerator goes from a theoretical technology to something that's in everyone's home in like less than a century. Only capitalism can do that. Like, but in terms of what I would call primary research, like just going out there and learning about the universe, I don't think that is well served by the capitalist incentive structure. And in fact, is not being, like, there's a crisis of like that research is not being done very much in our system today, which is why like things, like if you think like 40 years ago, we sent someone to the moon, and like a lot of NASA scientists would say we couldn't do it today. Like the funding and the necessary resources aren't in place for us to go to the moon now that we did like in the 60s. And I think that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And I don't think it's one that capitalism successfully addresses.
Yeah, I would agree that I don't think that capitalism has natural incentives in place for pursuing this kind of long range research. I absolutely agree. I don't think there's an easy solution. I'm gonna fall back on my classic answer, which is I think we should promote a culture which promotes those long-term explorations, like going to space and things like that. We should try to have a culture that values these things enough that we're going to give money to charity, essentially.
Yeah. So I'm going to make a problematic point that I'm not necessarily advocating for the results of this, but I would argue that like when you look at a technology like that, so let's say like splitting the atom or putting a man on the moon, being the king that does that, there's a lot of incentive for that. Being a citizen of the country that does that, there's not a lot of incentive. And often those goals are best served by like a highly centralized, undemocratic government, which is why like a lot of like look at Iran, may be the second nation in history to like successfully develop nuclear technology where no one else has done it. Like there's very little incentive for Australia to get a nuclear missile, but Iran is managing to do it under a highly totalitarian regime.
Yeah, it's really funny how that works, where in that sort of situation, like in order to get research that you would never get by the individual people, you need a non-representative government. So you have the ability to produce things that people essentially don't want, which can be a good thing, but it can also be a very bad thing. So it's a very kind of, it's you definitely, I think, playing with fire, but I understand the value in it.
No, I'm not advocating for authoritarianism at all. I think it is troubling, I think it is a fact that's easy to swallow and hard to digest. Like,
yeah, it can be, I like that.
Because like, I do think it's true. I don't know what that says or what the call to action is there. But I do think there's a certain amount of like, there's very little, like, again, looking at like nuclear technology, for example, like democratic nations have been very slow to adopt nuclear energy. And in many cases, we're actually seeing like backpedaling. Like in France and Germany, they're like decommissioning functioning nuclear power plants because it's unpopular among people because they don't understand, well, in my opinion, because of a misunderstanding of the science.
Yeah.
And whereas in the developing world, like China is like probably the biggest push towards nuclear energy. And again, like Iraq was doing it until we got involved there. Like like basically name all over like the Middle East. They're doing it because they see the writing on the wall, and they have, again, it costs $1 gazillion to build a nuclear power plant, but that's nothing if you're a Shah or a king or whatever.
I would say that I think one of the main reasons why it's financially difficult for us to build nuclear power plants here is because there's just so much restrictions by government. I do think that in the context of more of a free market, there's absolutely enough financial incentives to cost them to be invested in and created without any authoritarianism. But
I agree with you. I would argue that that is a result of the fact that in a free market system, it's a lot harder for a democratic majority to like enforce that will. Like, I really think the majority of people are against nuclear energy.
Yeah.
And that the government is serving. There's no incentive really. Like, people talk about the oil lobby or whatever, but like the profit that a nuclear power plant drives is so immense that no amount of like lobbying by big oil is going to stop it. It's really individual people who, again, are probably really being influenced by big oil lobbying themselves, but like individual people really don't like nuclear technology. They think it's dangerous. Yeah. They think it's wasteful. Like, the nuclear waste thing boggles my mind because people are like, look at all this like waste. And you're like, okay, but like,
relative
what
to
is your alternative? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like,
it's very strange.
You're going to tell me a coal power plant produces no waste? Like, we have solutions to deal with that? Like, people are like, what do you do with nuclear waste? I'm like, yeah. Like, a handful of uranium rods, I can deal with more than I can deal with like thousands of tons of CO2.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely strange.
Yeah.
Especially with, I don't know much about the technology, but allegedly the newer generation of nuclear power plants use their old waste as fuel. So it just seems
there's lots of emerging technology. There's a lot, like nuclear technology is constantly being improved. And but unfortunately, like, it's not being done here. Like, China is building the most advanced nuclear power plants in the world, and we're not. And like, we should look at like why. Like,
it's a good question. I mean, I don't know. It's odd to me that it has such a bad reputation. Like, I know shows like The Simpsons always portrayed it as such an obviously dangerous thing, but it seems like it was a kind of a conversation that was very much assumed. I know it's always associated with nuclear weapons
and meltdowns, the Fukushima thing, I think, set us back. That was like when I talked about decommissioning in France and Germany, like that was a major trigger for shutting down nuclear power. But again, like, I don't know.
Don't build on fault lines. I don't know.
Yeah, or just like, you know, like, how many in Canada every year there's like a huge accident, like, of oil spilling everywhere. Like, there's that big train derailment in Quebec like only a few years ago, and like, people forget about that so fast, but like Fukushima we remember forever.
I think it's a perfect example of compared to what.
Yeah,
it's the big question we should be asking. Is obviously it's an imperfect solution like all solutions, but how good is it compared to the alternatives we know about right now?
I think that like people kind of take this like total war approach to some of these issues where it's like environmentalism is a big one for this. So rather than people looking at like the overall picture, they're like, every single thing that big oil tries to do, we're going to fight it. Like, every shipping terminal, every pipeline, everything. Rather than looking at like, you know, pipelines are shitty, they cause a lot of problems. They're probably better than rail and truck, like, which are the realistic alternatives. And you're not going to cripple the industry by letting them build a pipeline. Like, now, how and where that gets built and how much money the government fronts and things like that, like, those are important questions. And I'm not going to say any particular pipeline project was good. I often think they're very under-vetted and kind of rammed through. But like, you need to look at, again, opposed to what? Like,
yeah, I've had that conversation with someone where they acknowledged that there is good evidence that pipelines produce better environmental results, and yet they were in principle against pipelines, and I found that fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
I know,
difficult to approach.
It boggles my mind.
Yeah. I know. I feel like I would love to do a separate one of these talks about the whole issue around global warming and people like Michael Mann, who I find very fascinating. I don't know if you know much about Michael Mann.
I do not.
But he's a central figure in the whole global warming controversy. And he's someone who I consider to be quite fraudulent based on how he engages with the public. There's a few lawsuits surrounding him that are fascinating but yeah, I feel like this would be a good talk to get into separately, because I would I would love for you to check out some of his stuff. So I'm not just speaking to him and having you just take my word for it. But
no, absolutely. I think that would be like a good episode to do back to back with Standard Oil. Like
yeah, absolutely.
Kind of fitting. Yeah.
I think this relates to that, and also Rockefeller as well, for sure.
Yeah, I think like it's no secret that global warming is really the biggest issue of scientific literacy. Like when we're talking about like charlatans and like dissemination of unscientific information and scientific consensus and like all of this stuff, like global warming is really the one, because it's such a large and complicated issue that it's very difficult. People don't understand it. And so like it's very tribal. It's very like my experts agree with me. Like
the implications are so profound. They're international. They apply to everyone who shares this planet. So it's a very all or nothing kind of thing.
Global warming is an example of an issue that democracy and I'm not advocating for authoritarianism
just
or
say
anything.
Just say it.
Democracy is handling this issue very poorly. It really shows the cracks and the seams in democracy and how it fails to tackle with large long-term issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's
not
short-term
something
nature
you can do in 4 years. That's the problem. Like
that's a huge problem with any kind of long-term big problem.
I think like it's not the only one. I would say national debt is another one that we're seeing democracy handle very poorly.
It's like a perfect example.
Yeah, because it's just too long-term. You can't like your country has trillions of dollars of debt. You can't pay that off in 4 years. Like,
do you want to be the politician who's known for lowering taxes for the rich, or whatever? Or I guess or you'd be known as a politician who was raising taxes. Like I believe that lowering taxes would pay off the national debt faster, but whatever the solution is, it's going to piss off a lot of people. Is the point I guess I'm making. And you don't want to be that politician.
In Alberta, we saw that. Like we're kind of lucky. And he's highly controversial, but like Ralph Klein paid off like a huge debt and did it through a lot of austerity, a lot of cuts, and raised taxes in some areas as well. And like it was immensely unpopular, even though it worked. Like it's now it's not seen well by history.
Yeah, no, that does not give me much faith in our future. The fact that that's remembered that way.
Yeah, well, and like. He was certainly not the right guy to be a visionary because of a lot of other things too. But
it's true. Complicated the whole effort.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else we should touch on?
No, I think I'm glancing at my list of notes, and those are all the things that I wanted to ask you. And I think those, is there any? I know.
Here's like one more I'll touch on.
Cool.
Because in doing my research for this, I found that a lot of the discussions around scientific literacy are aimed at children. And like, it is often seen as a problem of our education system that people are not educated. And I kind of disagree. That I think that a lot of it is like adults. I really think it's an effort thing, more of like an ability thing. I think that a lot of people could do better just by trying and don't. Which is why I don't think the education system is necessarily the right solution. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, is this something where we have to focus on the next generation, or can we make meaningful change in like adults who are set in their ways? Maybe that's just a general question for like any problem. But like,
I think there's probably
in particular here, everything I found was like, how do we get 6-year-olds to be better at scientific literacy?
That's so strange.
I know. Well. Scientists, I think, are very quick to just give up on like the people now. They're like, I think like people aren't vaccinating. People think the world is flat. Like, let's try it.
This is like, just step away from this dumpster fire of a generation and move on to something with more potential.
The flat Earth thing always gets me because like it is so easy. Like we did the experiments in school to prove that the Earth is round. Like it's so easy to yourself with no authority involved at all. Like, take a drive for an hour, see that the shadows are different, do the math, boom, like the world is round. Like, that's so easy to do that it boggles my mind that people can just like not believe it.
I think flat Earth beliefs are a perfect testament to the mind's ability to interpret data in whatever way we want. And just, I find it fascinating, just the whole psychology and movement around it. Like, I just find it's a fascinating study of human beings more than anything.
This is what I really worry about. It is really the worst result, because what happens is you have people spreading disinformation, and then the result of that is that some people say everything out there is bullshit.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they just reject everything. And that's how you get like all these conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And like, to me, that's a flaw in the expert system, because science shouldn't be represented by people. It's like, it's a body unto itself. It's something you can engage with directly. Like, you don't need to trust some scientists. You can go, like, people did it fucking thousands of years ago. You can go prove the world is round. Like, that's something you can do very easily with like a grade 9 education. You can prove that the world is round. And that people should see that as very empowering. Like, I could go do that. Yeah. I could like go prove that the world is round. I could do something that was like a monumental result at some point in history. And they just don't. Like,
yeah, I do think that's a big thing that I would like to teach in schools, is what constitutes real knowledge. Like, I don't think we need to teach any scientific conclusions to kids in school. I think we need to talk about what makes this conclusion any more valid than this conclusion. What is the basis of our belief?
What is proof? Like, what is evidence? Like, the theory of it, so that people really understand what's going on.
So that they can feel empowered enough to pursue those questions and those answers, and feel like they actually know that the earth is round. And I think the big problem is people don't feel empowered to do that. They don't know what makes something true. They think lived experience makes something true, or whatever else is the modern narrative today. And I think approaching that, I think that can be done young. But as you say, I think it's more of a cultural thing, where we have a very strange cultural attitudes of what constitutes truth, and unless that's addressed, that it's much deeper, I think.
As like a math guy, I think everyone just like learn a proof, like see something really proven. And mathematics is great because you can actually, like, it's none of this like, oh, like it seems to be, you can be like, yeah, like quadratic theorem is provable. It's a truth of the universe that is irrefutable. And you can really like do that. It doesn't have to be something you memorized in school. You can see why it works. The machinery, like you can open the hood and see what's going on. And like, I think if more people did that, they'd interact with science and maybe information as a whole, like differently.
Yeah, I think that would be a good place to start for sure.
Yeah.
One proof.
Honestly, like,
I agree.
love just, like showing, and most proofs, like coming up with a proof is really hard, but like understanding a proof is usually pretty easy.
Yeah, I've heard that the proof for 1 + 1 is like a whole book.
Well, like it depends on how you're going to prove it, I guess.
Right.
Like,
I guess to what foundational assumption are you going to?
Yeah, like we don't need to get all into it, but there's like at the beginning of the 20th century, there's a huge effort to like justify math, like to find these like core predicates that you could derive like all of math from, and it became like a huge body of work. So like that's where it's coming from. It's like 1 + 1, and you're like, okay, well, like we have to define that in like formal, rigorous language and like show that it like works.
And it gets so just esoteric and mind. No, I'm absolutely. There is a version of a proof that is very approachable for the average person and empowering, and that should be talked about for sure.
A very empowering proof that I like to do for people, and maybe I'll do it on here one day. The Cantor diagonalization argument is a proof that not all infinities are the same size. That like some infinite objects are larger than other infinite objects, which is like kind of like a profound, like mind-bending result. But it's actually like a very approachable. I shouldn't say very approachable, but I think it's approachable for people with like high school math to like understand it enough and be convinced of it and be like, yeah, like that is true. And to kind of see in real life, like which infinities are category A and which infinities are category B, and which infinities might be like a different category that we haven't classified yet. Like,
yeah, okay. I feel like you're going to hurt my brain a lot when you do that, but that's okay.
Yeah, we should try like, I thought about doing like screen sharing and having like graphics and stuff on screen for this, but we haven't tested it yet. I don't know. We should do like a trial run of that at some point.
Of so during the video, not editing it into it after the fact, but during the video.
Yeah, like I mean, we could edit it in after the fact, but you'd need to see it like while I'm doing it.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's possible, let's try that out for sure.
I think like maybe Standard Oil would be a good one because there's so many great comics and like editorials.
I love that comment you left on
the squid one. That's like the one I always think of.
Yeah, well, that's in the
like
video.
Gripping the White House and the Capitol building and everything, and you're like,
yeah, they reference that the giant squid octopus creature a lot.
Yeah, I don't even know why it's an octopus. Other than it's just menacing.
Just all the tentacles. There's tentacles and everything.
Like.
Yeah, so I guess do you want to do final words here?
Yes.
I think I go first this time?
I think the person who presents gets the final word. I think
that makes sense to me too.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, final word. Harshest criticism.
I mean, honestly, I don't have much of a harsh criticism of what you're saying. I think I liked what you had to say. It made a lot of sense to me. I think what I would say is that we just have a balancing act between we need to appeal to authority when necessary, because we can't just, as you say, sit like frozen, unable to move. We need to appeal to authority enough to move forward and use the knowledge they've attained. But at the same time, we can't be led astray by all these, charlatans and bad incentives, and having a strong scientific knowledge within the culture cannot be replaced by anything beyond that.
Okay. I guess, I don't have much of a response to that. Like, that's kind of the same things I believe. The things I would like to leave people with is question why the people you see as authorities you see that way. Like, question how you pick the authorities that you appeal to. And to question whether complexity is being used to enhance your understanding of the issue or to obfuscate it and reduce your understanding of the issue.
Yeah.
And why someone would do one or the other.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Be watching for the unnecessary complications.
Yeah, sometimes complexity is only valuable when it leads to a more complex answer. When it just appears the issue.
When it actually explains more phenomena that we're observing, like Occam's razor.
Yes, exactly. Like if it gives you a better solution, that's great. But if it just makes it more complicated and doesn't add anything, then it's just making it more complicated.
Oh man, yeah. Cool. Well, I'm jumping in on your final words, so I feel like that's out of bounds.
If you have something to throw in there.
We didn't really quite talk about Occam's razor, but that seems not like a central enough point to this video to have it. I just think
this won't be the last time we talk about scientific literacy.
Yeah, cool.
Something that I really harp on a lot. But
cool.
I also want to leave people with one last final remark.
Yeah.
The final word.
Okay.
Embrace falsifiability and question what would lead you to falsify your own beliefs, and see that as a point of strength rather than a point of weakness.
Nice.
Yes.
Cool.
Okay. I'm going to turn off the recording.
Fairly well.